My guest today is Joshua Capitanio, curator and public services librarian here at Stanford for the East Asia Library. Josh received his PhD in East Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Pennsylvania in 2008, and then he was assistant and then associate professor at University of the West here in California. And then he came here to Stanford to start that current role, and we're going to be talking today a little bit about that transition from the university professoriate to university librarian, as well as Josh's continued research in this field. And on the subject of that research, that scholarship covers medieval Chinese Buddhism and Taoist ritual theory, with recent articles in Journal of the American Academy of Religion, History of Religions, and Newman, the International Review for the History of Religions. And Josh has also published translations in 84,000 Asian Medicine and the anthology Buddhism in Medicine, and he is himself editor of the Journal of East Asian Libraries. So thank you so much, Josh, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I guess I thought we would start with the research, talk a little bit about your interest in medieval China, medieval Chinese religion, Buddhism and Taoism and their relationship to one another. How did you gravitate towards that particular field in the first place?
Sure. I started with an interest in Buddhism. Like as a child, I was interested in Buddhism. My parents had a lot of books on religion and philosophy. I remember my sixth grade teacher stole my copy of the Tao Te Ching. So yeah, I was in.
All for their own reading?
Yeah, yeah. I wrote a report on it, and she asked me to borrow it, and then I never got it back. Um, Yeah, I mean, and in high school, I became interested in Buddhism specifically. I was a philosophy major when I went to college the first time, and then I dropped out and was like working as a computer programmer and just kind of like studying Buddhism on my own. Um, and that eventually, I was interested in Zen Buddhism. I was reading a lot of like translations, and I started to wonder about the quality of the translations. I thought maybe I would be able to understand it better if I could understand the language. So, I came to understand that Zen Buddhism had come from China and that most of the texts that I was reading had been translated from Chinese. So I started learning Chinese. And ended up going back to college and doing a bachelor's in Chinese at UCLA, where I had the chance to take a bunch of classes on Buddhism with different professors, and kind of became interested in Chinese as well, like having, beginning to learn the language. I kind of got interested in the literary tradition. So I went to grad school with the intention of working on Chinese Buddhism. I went to University of Pennsylvania where I worked with Victor Mayer. And just, I think my first or second year there, I encountered the work of Michel Strickman. His Chinese magical medicine book had just been published, which is like really, uh, a really important work on the relationship between Buddhism and Taoism, specifically like Buddhist and Taoist ritual in medieval China. And I encountered Steve Bokenkamp's book, Early Taoist Scriptures. And I was really interested in the last section of that, which deals with this particular Taoist tradition, the Lingbao school, which
Mm.
had kind of like borrowed a lot of terms and ideas from the Buddhist scriptures that were being translated into China at the time. So I remember I took a class with Victor on, it was on the history of the Chinese language, which is like one of his sort of pet topics. He's really interested in that. And I wrote a paper on this device that you found in those Taoist texts called the hidden Brahma language. Basically, it was an attempt to kind of create a Chinese origin for like the transliterated Sanskrit terms that you find in Buddhist literature. And he liked the paper, and I think he sensed that I was interested in these kinds of connections between Buddhism and indigenous Chinese religion. So he ended up like the next year doing a whole graduate seminar on the topic of like so-called Buddho-Daoism. Yeah, I don't know, that just
I'm
kind of
curious
became
about
my
that. Yeah,
thing.
the Buddho-Daoism, because you mentioned in passing, all these mentors, but then also reading Stephen Bokenkamp's early Taoist scriptures. And he was a guest of the Host Center recently and
Oh,
came and
okay.
sat in on this podcast. So naturally, I kind of want to seize on that a little bit because there is a thread in your research that is partly about the rivalry of Taoism and Buddhism in this field, in terms of who came to what ideas and which ones are sort of properly elevated or terrestrial, that revolve around, among other things, this notion of self-cultivation or internal alchemy, where, between you're interested, I think, it seems like in Taoism, insofar as it uses talismans and rituals, but insofar as it also uses meditation forms and questions of where that arises. Can you tell us about sort of how your thinking about the relationship of those two religions has evolved and maybe where it is now?
So I think I initially was interested in how Buddhism became sort of Chinese, Sinicized. I was really influenced by Zerker's work on, the Buddhist conquest of China, and so I was more approaching Taoism from this Buddhist angle, and I was curious about the fact that Taoists were like using Buddhist terms and kind of, copying Buddhist literary tropes in their uh, in their scriptures. And so most of the early work I did on this in graduate school was kind of from that angle. I was very excited. The one project that I did as a grad student, which I've continued like milking. I mean, I just referenced it in an article I wrote earlier this year, was when I found this text in the Taoist canon that attributed like a method of internal alchemy to Bodhidharma, the patriarch of Zen Buddhism in China. And so I was really interested in that sort of, and there's kind of I think even before I had gone to grad school, I had encountered the idea in like, I don't know, maybe like Arthur Waley or Kenneth Chen or something, about how, Chinese Buddhists, there's this sort of vague idea that Chinese Buddhism was influenced by Taoism, and that, you know, um, particularly the like most quintessentially Chinese forms of Buddhism, like Chan Buddhism, show some sort of Taoist influence, but it's never really explained clearly how that happened.
And it,
It's just a general sense that this doesn't seem exactly like Indian Buddhism. There's something very Chinese about it, and
yeah,
this must have come from
but it sounds like some of your arguments
Taoism.
are also pointing to the way in which the influence goes the other direction, and that's important too.
Well, yeah, I mean, so I sort of started from that idea that, Taoists were kind of like stealing from Buddhism, and I think that was sort of my gateway into Taoist studies itself. And so I kind of like became a Taoist studies. I mean, I began to get a little bit annoyed with this kind of like facile and explanation that, Taoists just copy Buddhists.
Sure.
And I started, the more I actually read Taoist texts, the more I started to at least think that I could perceive some sort of internal logic and see even the sort of wholesale appropriation of some Buddhist elements as a kind of strategic move um, that sort of made sense in a way, or was made sense of at some point.
Yeah. So on the other
And
side of it, just to pick up a kind of impossibly big question that you dropped in the path here, which is how did Buddhism become Chinese? Do you have your own thesis on that now, or is there a thesis that you gleaned from this community of scholars you are working with that you feel is correct?
yeah, I don't know. Um, I kind of go back and forth on it. I mean, Bob Sharf just gave a talk here on the origins of koan literature, and that has given me a lot to think about it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that I don't think that the general story of how Buddhism became Chinese is wrong. I think it's true that like Chinese people, made Buddhism Chinese, but in many ways by kind of uh,
Aligning it with religious traditions that were already in place.
yeah, finding ways to sort of translate Indian Buddhist concepts into Chinese, or reframe Indian Buddhist ideas in contexts that were more kind of amenable to like Chinese modes of thought. Um, but the idea that it was like as simple as just Chinese Buddhists kind of interpreted Buddhism through Taoist frameworks, I don't particularly agree with.
Yeah,
In actuality, like on both sides, people really knew what they were doing and
yeah,
what they were about, and any kind of crossover that you see between the two traditions is intentional,
yeah,
and they're it's not just kind of like haphazard,
yeah. And that's doing a disservice to centuries of scholars who are thinking about this pretty seriously. Yeah, that makes sense. And the reason why, I'm starting to think about it now a little bit in terms of evaluating these historical figures as scholars is because I'm curious to connect this to what you see as being your own methods that you were trained in and that you have now taken with you into a new vocation. Because I think one thing we'll end up talking about in this conversation is the skills that one learns in this field in graduate school and on the tenure track, and ways in which those skills can be responsibly used or effectively used in other avenues. And so as you're looking at, historical scholars who are thinking both within their own tradition about their own primary texts and their own primary scriptures and intertextually and maybe interculturally or interreligiously about other texts that are out there, I'm what that brings to mind for me is looking at your own articles and thinking about the way in which there is a strong reliance on your own sense of primary sources, your own abilities to do translations, which has now become a big part of your work, as well as, of course, the running footnotes that involve being aware of what other scholars have said, as you've mentioned, being aware of this entire community of people you've worked with and whose
Mm.
mentors you know kind of by association. So tell us a little bit about how you take those two tracks of humanistic academic engagement, translation, curation, historical work that involves primary sources, and the secondary, and how you think about those skills in your current work. As somebody who is working in special collections in some ways with primary sources, also trying to stay, up to date and keep everybody else up to date in the secondary research. How has your own training enabled you to keep, those two aspects of scholarship alive?
Um, well, yeah, I mean, I've kind of ended up in the perfect situation in that I'm covering East Asian studies and religious studies here at Stanford, and my own training was sort of, um, I mean, at Penn, I would say like getting a degree in East Asian studies, uh, at least with the people with whom I was studying, there was not much of a method or a methodology. It was really just learn to read Chinese really well and read as much Chinese as you can. Um, and then at the same time, I was taking classes at Princeton with Stephen Tizer in the religious studies department and getting exposed to a more kind of religious studies approach, which is very methodology heavy. And actually, after I graduated, because I sort of decided that I wanted to be in the religious studies field, I really made a lot of efforts on my own to kind of fix what I felt were some deficiencies in my own training related to my familiarity or my lack of familiarity with um, specifically like secondary scholarship in the field of religious studies. And I'm personally very interested in sort of theory, theoretical approaches that are important in the field of religious studies. And for a while, those were like kind of separate endeavors. And I used to get really frustrated when I was reading religious studies scholarship because most of it is about Western religions. And it was hard for me to see um, how that could be applied, how I could apply those things to Chinese religion. So there are a few um, scholars. Rob Campany is the person that comes to mind immediately, whose work was really important for me in terms of providing kind of a model of how to connect those. And so, like in my own scholarship, as you can see, I tend to prefer to publish in more like religious studies journals, and to write more from to write about Chinese religions, using um, Western theoretical approaches. But then, yeah, also, I mean, as a librarian, those are exactly the fields that I cover. So
Yeah.
I have to also be familiar with what people are going to be, what kind of resources people might need as scholars of East Asia, and
Yeah.
also what kinds of things people might need as scholars of religion. So,
Yeah. Yeah, that's great, and I can totally understand how it is in fact a perfect fit, the kinds of background that you have and the kind of work you're doing now. But I wonder because a lot of students who go through the PhD track who maybe do visiting assistant professorships or postdoctoral positions before looking at something like library work or other kinds of university jobs worry about how hyper specialized they may be in a particular area before they offer a different kind of service to these institutions and being able to prove that, right, to an interview committee. And so, could you talk about just in practical terms what it was like to go after this job here and, and explain what you thought you could bring to the library and explain that the kind of training you had done, which tends to be traditionally for a particular kind of instructor and researcher role made sense in this other domain?
yeah. I mean, the position that I applied for was different than the position that I'm doing. I mean, it's the same position,
Hmm.
but the role was defined
Hmm.
differently at the time. So, now, like in my signature, I'm like a curator for East Asian Studies and curator for Religious Studies and public services librarian. Like technically that's about like an 80-20 split between my curatorial duties and the public services stuff. But when I was hired, I mean, the job that I applied for was actually like it was just public services librarian, and and then the curatorial stuff was kind of an add-on. So it was like 60% public services, 40% curation. And I mean, I got super lucky. Like that was really the perfect job for me to apply for at the time because public services is more about I mean, I remember like when I was preparing for the job, trying to figure out what exactly it is. I think if you ask 10 public service librarians, they'll give you 10 different answers. But I mean, it's really just doing the public facing part of the library. Um, and the main thing there is communication skills. So, I mean, I have a PhD. I had been a professor for 8 years. I think it was fairly easy for me to make the argument that I have, the level of verbal and written communication skills needed for something like this.
Right.
Um,
You're an established writer, you're an established teacher.
yeah, I mean, I can write. I'm comfortable, talking to people, mostly, and you know, I I know how to like respond to emails and that kind of thing. So, um, it was really just sort of a matter of convincing them that I could do the communication side of things, and then there was this 40% curatorial stuff that at the time I didn't really know exactly what that involved, but I think it was I basically just said, look, I have a PhD in this field. I have taught in this field for 8 years. I trained graduate students in this field. I've been an undergraduate, graduate student, professor, and mentor of graduate students in this field. So I think I understand what people are expecting from the library.
Yeah.
Um, and then what ended up happening is that, as I learned more about the collection development side or the subject specialist side or whatever, I kind of gravitated towards that kind of work because it was the kind of work that made, I think, better use of my own skill set. I mean, the public services stuff, like I think a lot of people can do. It's really just, staying on top of communication
Yeah.
and creating events in the calendar
Mm.
and so I've been here for almost 10 years. I've kind of gradually taken on more collection development and now recently even more kind of like metadata and special collection stuff that again directly uses these like skills that I have that other people don't. Um, but yeah, I think initially that was like a really good position for getting my foot in the door because it was partly public services and I really just had to make a case that I was like a decent communicator. And then I had the opportunity to kind of learn the more technical collection development side stuff on the job,
That makes
and
sense.
then eventually kind of move into that area.
Yeah, neat. So one thing that also it sounds like changed or that you gained a new appreciation for in those early years of moving to a new position was knowing other kinds of communities that exist in the university and between different universities, right? Because you had this community that we've talked about of mentors and advisors and colleagues, but there is also a community, that maybe, folks in grad school or maybe even folks in faculty departments aren't always as aware of librarians who are working together and collaborating together on these events, on these projects, on these public-facing initiatives. So what was it like to discover or maybe just integrate yourself into that community, leading all the way up to, running this journal that is representative of a community?
It was great. Librarians are, I like librarians. And I mean, I remember seeing things as a graduate student in my own department. And I mean, I've heard lots of stories about, you know, departments that don't maybe function as well as they could, or, individual egos that, I mean, I think the kind of people that gravitate toward library work are not like the sort of like, look at me kind of people, I mean, I really enjoy actually sort of being in a support role. And so, I mean, I think the library community in general is just it's very supportive. It's very collaborative. We have our own, like, there's a professional society that I'm part of, the Council on East Asian Libraries. The day I started, my former boss sent an email to the group. They added me to the group. Everybody, I was getting emails from all these people. Congratulations. I went to the conference. People are coming up to me like, oh, like introducing themselves. It's just a very like, um, yeah, pro
Mhm.
networking, really welcoming community.
And then throughout that time, you've also continued to write, but the writing has taken on a different emphasis, right? Like you're doing more translation work. You're maybe thinking about big projects a little bit differently. What did you realize in that time? Like, in what ways did this not writing for a tenure review committee, for instance, free up in terms of other possible work?
And when I came to Stanford, I had a couple different projects that were still going on, and I knew that I wanted to that I wanted to at least get these articles that I had in development published, and was hoping that I would be able to continue publishing. Uh, I had been thinking about a monograph for a while, and yeah, I did. I remember reading. I just recently completed the draft of what hopefully will end up being my first monograph, and it has nothing to do with my dissertation, or it was a completely new project. And yeah, I remember reading this interview in something like Chronicle of Higher Education with an author who was talking about their new book, and they were saying, "Oh, because this is my second book, the first book was really like I was locked into this formula of, publish your dissertation and get it out as quickly as possible. And now that this is my second book, I feel really excited because I'm able to try new things." And yeah, I remember thinking, well, this is great. I can just write my first book can be my second book. I'm not, if I do end up writing a book, which at the time I wasn't even sure I would, it's not going to affect my progression as a librarian. It's not going to, I mean, sure, it's like a nice thing to have, but
Hmm.
it's not for tenure. I'm not doing it to meet any requirements.
Hmm.
So it's kind of like I could write any kind of book. I could do translations, which I had always been advised to, not spend a lot of time on because they're not considered maybe as important by a tenure review committee as other things. But I really like doing translations. So I always thought that was kind of too bad. Like if more people were doing more translations, we would have a lot more translated stuff, which probably in the end might be better than having all of these published dissertations, whatever.
Yeah. So there's a certain way in which what has become institutionally expected in terms of the writing that you have to do to get a PhD, the writing that you have to do for the following stages, it has some utility, but is also confining. Where the possibility of working more on translations, more on a sort of second book model, where you're thinking more about a large audience rather than about the audience of three that is your dissertation committee or your tenure review committee or what have you, might actually be not just good for you as a writer, but good for the public, good for the field maybe in some kinds of ways. it makes
Yeah,
me
I think so.
it leads me to another detail that I remember from a conversation we had a couple months ago when we were thinking about this interview, where when I read a lot of material and attend classes or conferences about this crisis in the humanities and crisis in higher education at large, where a lot of PhD students are looking for places to go with their degrees that may not be the professoriate because, maybe because they're not interested in that career, or maybe because that career is rapidly closing and dwindling, and it's a really difficult problem. It's often framed, in the kind of optimistic think pieces and books and conferences as your particular training or particular skills provide you an opportunity that you're not realizing, or a set of opportunities, which is great. And I think it is real and is true that we need to think about having cultivated a lot of tools that do have use in various disciplines where we just have to get your foot in the door, like you said, with an initial position that allows you to learn a new area. But you also put it differently. You said, yes, opportunity, but also responsibility. That you've also been trained in a particular way to know particular things, to have a particular knowledge base, a particular set of skills that the world can use, that the field can use, that the public can use, that the university certainly can use. And you want to be able to do something with that too going forward. So could you say a little bit about that kind of reframing of what it is to have this background, and how you treat that responsibility personally?
Yeah, I mean that's of course like a really personal thing. I would not expect everyone to feel that way or, fault anyone for not feeling that way.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, I mean, for me, there's kind of two separate but related things. One is that, as I mentioned, I got into Buddhism in the first place through some interest in translation. I was like 18 and I was like reading these books and I was meditating and I was like, I'm not becoming enlightened. It must be because I don't know Chinese. You know what I mean? Like that, which is kind of a silly thing, but my interest was like aroused and sustained because there were enough things available in translation that I could kind of, oh, I read the Platform Sutra. I guess I should read, the Yulu of the five houses. There was like stuff to read, and so I spent a lot of time learning how to read Buddhist texts with different experts. I'm still learning. Here at Stanford, I'm getting the opportunity to work with people, and I'm pretty confident that I can read a lot of things pretty well, and I've read things that other people will never read because they're not available in English. So I enjoy the process of translation. It's just like, it's a, like Confucius said, it's a joy to like get good at something and then do that thing. And it's kind of, you can spend the whole day writing an article and then the next day you might end up like throwing everything you wrote away and rewriting it. But like if I spend a day doing a translation, at the end of that day I can be like, okay, I just translated 3 pages of this and now I'm 3 pages closer to the end. So I mean, I enjoy translation work, and I have um I've had there are these different organizations, 84,000 or BDK. I've had the chance to work with some of these different organizations that are looking for people like me who have the skills and the interest in translation. Um, and the other thing is, in this field of Taoist studies, like I said, I sort of stumbled into this field of Taoist studies and, had the opportunity to train with people who, usually don't train graduate students. And at some point sort of realized that this is actually a really small field, and I'm one of only, like less than 10 people in North America that are actually looking at this particular group of texts from this particular period on this particular topic. And I feel some, I like, not that I can do it myself, but I feel some obligation to try to keep producing scholarship to contribute to the vitality of that field here in North America, dwindling as it is.
In terms of that final reflection, I thought I would just ask for students, in our program and other programs who are nearing the end of their PhD or are in postdoctoral positions where they don't know what's next and where they don't know where their future lies in these fields and are thinking both about these opportunities and these responsibilities. What would you advise them if they're looking at library jobs, for instance, or other kinds of university jobs? What would you say about preparing for an interview, looking for positions, or just generally how to frame themselves as talented, knowledgeable people whose work should be esteemed?
Well, I would first of all encourage people to look at library positions. In East Asian Studies, our professional organization, the Council on East Asian Libraries, we have a job page on our professional organization website, which has a lot of listings. Um, I mean, there's a lot I think that could be said. There's a lot to learn. There are some schools that are more amenable to hiring PhDs. There are some schools that will require you to have an MLIS degree. So it's good to kind of get an understanding of the difference between those types of things. I think that any kind of library experience that you can get as a graduate student is helpful. Like if you need some extra cash and there's an opportunity available to work in the library, that's a good way to get, it's nice to have that background and you can kind of get a sense for what it's like working in a library. I worked in a library as an undergrad. My Most of my classmates when I was a grad student worked in our library. Again, like they're looking for communication skills. They're looking for if it's assuming it's like a bibliographer or subject specialist position, they're looking for like, an understanding of the field, an understanding of what graduate students and faculty will need, and it's pretty easy to make a case that you know these things as a graduate student or
Yeah,
maybe somebody who has teaching experience. So, but yeah, understanding, I think just sort of more about how an academic library works and what the different kind of roles are in there is important. I think something like public services or you know, subject specialist, curator, bibliographer position
yeah,
is easy to make a case for somebody with a humanities PhD. If you want to get into something like metadata or cataloging, then that requires more specialized
yeah.
skills, which you can learn on the job. I got the chance to learn on a job, but most people would go to school to learn
Right,
those kinds of
right.
things. So
And that's great. And, I think just to bring it all together, the idea that on the one hand, you are deserving of a position like that if you have that kind of training, you are the right kind of fit, but that it also would be affirming to the kinds of things that you've been doing, that, you are testament to that, that you've been able to continue to do really important work, kind of bringing together important materials, collaborating with other scholars. You've mentioned working with James Gentry and Mikhail Maras here in the Tibetan studies specialty and finding materials for them, but then also publishing your own work, your own translations and whatnot. And to be able to continue in that way an academic life and an academic vocation that's totally integral to what the university does. I think hopefully that's inspiring for a lot of scholars who are looking for places to go and looking for places to find as a home. So thanks so much for sharing that journey with us
yeah, happy
from the
to.
research to the profession. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you around at lots of Host Center events going forward, as we always do.
Great. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it as well.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank you.